Sir, stop right there. I work here. Badge, now. I'm a police lieutenant. That badge could be fake. Why am I being detained? Hands behind your back. What, I'm not resisting? Then stop turning. Get down. I'm standing still. You're forcing me. Dispatch, courthouse unit.
At approximately 7:12 a.m., a rookie uniformed officer assigned to exterior security fixated on one man standing near the steps, a tall black male in a tailored suit, calm posture, phone in hand, waiting for a colleague. That man was Lieutenant Marcus Hill, a 19-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, currently assigned to an interagency task force and due inside the courthouse for sworn testimony. What began as a casual glance turned into suspicion, then escalation, then a public detention that would collapse a young officer's career before lunch. The rookie officer, later identified as 26-year-old Daniel Croft, had been on solo courthouse detail for less than 3 months. According to multiple witnesses, Croft approached Hill with his hand already resting on his belt, voice sharp, tone confrontational, asking why Hill was loitering near a secure government building. Hill responded evenly, identifying himself as law enforcement and stating he was waiting to enter the building. Croft demanded identification. Hill produced his CPD badge and department-issued credentials. Instead of de-escalating, Croft scrutinized the badge, turned it over twice, and said words that several witnesses would later repeat to investigators. "That doesn't look real to me." The air shifted. People slowed their steps. Phones came out. Hill, visibly confused but composed, stated his name, rank, and unit, explaining that his credentials could be verified immediately through CPD dispatch. Croft rejected the explanation, stepped closer, and ordered Hill to place his hands behind his back. Hill asked one question, measured and direct. "On what grounds?" That question, witnesses say, is where everything changed. Croft's voice rose. He accused Hill of being uncooperative. Hill did not raise his voice. He did not step away. He did not resist. He repeated that he was a police lieutenant and asked for a supervisor. Croft responded by grabbing Hill's wrist. The movement was abrupt enough that a woman nearby audibly gasped. Hill stiffened but did not pull away. "I'm not resisting," he said clearly, words that would later be confirmed on body camera audio. Croft forced Hill's arms behind his back and applied handcuffs in full public view, announcing a detention for failure to comply. The sound of the cuffs snapping shut echoed off the stone steps. A courthouse security sergeant rushed over, asking what was happening. Before Croft could answer, Hill spoke again, louder now so the growing crowd could hear. "I am Lieutenant Marcus Hill, Chicago Police Department. I am being detained without cause." The tension outside the courthouse was thick, electric, the kind that tells you something irreversible is unfolding in real time. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because the next story is one you don't want to miss. Within minutes, CPD supervisors arrived, drawn by radio traffic and the crowd. One glance at Hill's face, his badge, his name, was enough to change the tone entirely. The cuffs came off. Apologies were murmured, then formalized. Croft was pulled aside. Body camera footage was secured. By 9:30 a.m., the incident was already moving through command channels. By noon, it had reached the superintendent's office. And by mid-afternoon, with video circulating internally and witness statements piling up, the decision was made. Chief of Police Anthony Ramirez called a press conference on less than 2 hours' notice. Standing at the podium, expression tight, he confirmed what the city was already buzzing about. Officer Daniel Croft had been terminated effective immediately. The reason, Ramirez said, was clear and unequivocal: unlawful detention, failure to recognize valid credentials, and conduct unbecoming an officer. As the chief spoke, the footage played silently on a screen behind him, a black lieutenant in handcuffs outside a courthouse, and a rookie officer learning in real time that the badge does not protect you from accountability when the evidence is this clear. The chief's words landed like a hammer, but the fallout was already spreading far beyond the press room as the footage leaked to local media, and then to national outlets within minutes. The body camera video showed the entire encounter from the rookie officer's point of view, the approach, the suspicion in his voice, the dismissive way he flipped the badge back toward Hill, and the moment he chose control over verification. In the background, courthouse steps filled with murmurs, confusion, and disbelief. Analysts would later note that at no point did Hill raise his voice, clench his fists, or make any movement that could reasonably be interpreted as a threat. Yet the language used by Croft escalated steadily, shifting from questions to commands, from commands to force. Internal radio logs revealed that Croft never attempted to run Hill's name through CPD systems before applying the cuffs, a basic step drilled into every recruit at the academy. Instead, he relied on what he would later describe in a written statement as instinct. That word, instinct, became central to the investigation almost immediately. Supervisors reviewing the footage flagged it as a red warning sign, especially given the location, the visibility, and the credentials presented. Lieutenant Hill, once uncuffed, was escorted inside the courthouse by a deputy chief who personally apologized and asked whether Hill needed medical attention. Hill declined, though witnesses noted the tightness in his jaw and the visible red marks on his wrists. Inside the building, Hill completed his testimony as scheduled, but the incident followed him from room to room, whispered by clerks, replayed on phones, already framed as another example of how quickly authority could turn into humiliation when race entered the equation. By late morning, the Fraternal Order of Police had requested an emergency briefing. By early afternoon, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability had opened a formal investigation. Emails marked urgent flew between City Hall, the police superintendent's office, and the mayor's legal counsel. The speed of the response was unusual, but officials knew why. This was not a civilian with an unclear narrative. This was a senior black officer, known within the department, publicly detained outside a courthouse on camera by a rookie. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Inside headquarters, command staff replayed the video frame by frame. One deputy chief paused the footage at the moment Croft says, "That doesn't look real to me," and asked the room a single question. What exactly didn't look real? No one answered. Croft, meanwhile, sat alone in a small interview room, his badge already removed, his radio silent, realizing with each passing minute that this was not going to end with counseling or retraining. Investigators pressed him on why he ignored Hill's request for a supervisor, why he dismissed department-issued credentials, why he escalated instead of stepping back. His answers circled back to the same explanation, that something felt off, that he believed Hill was testing him, that he thought asserting control was necessary. Outside the building, protesters had begun to gather, some chanting Hill's name, others holding signs that read, "If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone." News helicopters hovered. Social media lit up with side-by-side images of Hill in uniform and Hill in handcuffs. The pressure mounted by the minute. City officials understood that delay would be read as indifference. By the time Chief Ramirez stepped to the podium, the decision to fire Croft had already been signed, logged, and executed. But the story was no longer just about a termination. It was about what the footage exposed, how quickly bias could override training, and how fragile trust remained even within the ranks of law enforcement itself. Behind the scenes, the department moved into damage control mode, but the machinery of accountability was already in motion, and it was moving fast. By mid-afternoon, COPA investigators had collected statements from more than a dozen witnesses, including courthouse deputies, attorneys, and civilians who had been standing on the steps when the cuffs went on. Several described the same moment, the same shift in Croft's demeanor when Hill calmly asked for a supervisor. One witness said the rookie officer looked embarrassed, then angry, as if the request itself was a challenge to his authority. Another recalled Croft saying under his breath, "Everyone got a story," just before grabbing Hill's wrist. Those words did not appear in the initial incident report Croft submitted, a report investigators quickly flagged as incomplete and misleading. Surveillance cameras from the courthouse exterior filled in gaps the body cam could not, showing Hill standing still, hands visible, posture non-threatening, and Croft stepping into his space repeatedly. The video contradicted Croft's claim that Hill had attempted to walk away. Inside headquarters, legal advisors warned command staff that the longer Croft remained employed, even on desk duty, the worse it would look. The mayor's office called twice asking for updates. By the time the chief authorized termination, the department's risk assessment unit had already concluded that the detention met the threshold for a civil rights violation. Lieutenant Hill, meanwhile, sat with a small group of trusted colleagues in a private office, processing what had happened. He did not raise his voice. He did not celebrate the firing. He spoke quietly about how quickly the situation had spiraled and how familiar the feeling was despite his rank. He told one commander, "If my badge didn't stop it, imagine someone without one." That sentence would later appear, almost verbatim, in multiple news reports. As the afternoon wore on, national outlets picked up the story, framing it as a stark example of internal bias and the limits of professional courtesy when race enters the picture. Former officers were invited onto panels to debate whether the firing was justified. Most agreed it was unavoidable. Several noted that rookies are trained explicitly to verify credentials, especially when interacting with other law enforcement, and that Croft had skipped every safeguard. By early evening, the police union released a carefully worded statement saying it would review the case but acknowledged that the video raised serious concerns. That, too, was unusual. Back at the courthouse, the steps where Hill had been detained were now empty, but the image lingered. Chalk markings left by protesters outlined where Hill had stood, where the cuffs had closed, where the crowd had gathered. Inside the department, officers watched the footage on their phones, some in silence, others shaking their heads. A few younger officers admitted privately that they recognized the impulse Croft had acted on, the urge to assert control rather than pause. Supervisors took note of those conversations, understanding that this incident would now be used in training rooms as a case study in what not to do. As night fell, Chief Ramirez held a closed-door meeting with command staff and internal affairs, outlining next steps, including mandatory retraining, an expedited review of courthouse security protocols, and a full audit of rookie supervision. He was blunt. "This didn't just fail one officer," he said. "It failed our system." Outside, Lieutenant Hill finally left the building, escorted not by ceremony but by colleagues who understood the weight of the day. Cameras followed him down the steps. When asked for comment, he stopped, looked directly into the lens and said, "Accountability matters. Today it happened fast. That's how it should always work." Then he turned and walked away, leaving behind a city still buzzing, a department under scrutiny, and a story that was far from over. The morning after the firing, the ripple effects deepened, turning what had been a single confrontation into a department-wide reckoning. Roll calls across Chicago opened with the same directive. Supervisors were ordered to brief their units on the incident, not with spin, but with facts. The video was played without commentary. Officers watched the rookie's body cam capture the moment authority slipped into assumption, the subtle shift in tone, the refusal to verify, the handcuffs closing around the wrists of a fellow cop. In several districts, the rooms went quiet in a way that made commanders uneasy. Silence meant recognition. Silence meant people saw themselves in parts of the footage, even if they did not want to admit it. At headquarters, COPA investigators finalized their preliminary findings, concluding that Officer Croft had no legal basis for the detention, and that his actions were inconsistent with department policy, training, and constitutional standards. They also noted something more damning, that Croft's written report omitted key details, including Hill's repeated identification as a police lieutenant and his request for a supervisor. That omission elevated the case from poor judgment to potential dishonesty. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office requested the full file before noon, signaling that criminal review was not off the table. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hill was called into a meeting with the superintendent and the city's corporation counsel. They spoke candidly. The city anticipated litigation. Hill listened, arms crossed, expression controlled. He made it clear that this was not about a payout. It was about the record. He wanted the incident documented accurately and permanently, not buried under procedural language. Outside City Hall, community leaders held a press conference of their own, pointing to the speed of Croft's firing as proof that accountability was possible, but also questioning why it so often required clear video, public pressure, and an officer victim. One speaker said plainly, "If this had been a civilian, we all know the ending would have been different." That quote ran on every local channel by evening. Inside the police academy, instructors were already revising lesson plans. Croft's actions were dissected step by step, the missed decision points highlighted in red, verify credentials, call a supervisor, de-escalate. Each misstep carried a note: failure here escalates risk. Failure here violates rights. Failure here ends careers. The academy commandant addressed recruits directly, reminding them that the badge was not a shield against scrutiny, especially in the age of body cameras and instant exposure. Back in his apartment, Croft watched the coverage unfold, his name repeated by anchors, his photo pulled from academy graduation day now framed as a cautionary image. Friends stopped calling. Texts went unanswered. The department-issued phone was already turned in. The realization set in slowly, then all at once, that there would be no second chance, no quiet reassignment, no waiting for the news cycle to move on. His career had ended on courthouse steps in less than 10 minutes, but the consequences would follow him for years. Across the city, Lieutenant Hill returned to work, the routine unchanged on paper but heavier in practice. Officers greeted him with a mix of respect and discomfort. Some thanked him quietly for how he handled himself. Others avoided eye contact, unsure what to say. Hill noticed everything. He said little. He knew the footage would now live in training rooms, court filings, and public memory, a reminder that rank and tenure did not grant immunity from suspicion. As the week progressed, subpoenas were issued, union lawyers prepared responses, and federal civil rights attorneys requested access to the investigation. The incident outside the Chicago courthouse was no longer just a local story. It had become a national example, unfolding in real time, with more revelations still to come. By the end of the week, the narrative hardened into something unavoidable, a case study not just in misconduct but in exposure. Federal civil rights attorneys arrived quietly, without cameras, without statements, requesting raw footage, radio traffic, and training records tied to Croft's academy class. They wanted to know who signed off on his readiness, who supervised his courthouse assignment, and whether warning signs had been missed. Inside CPD headquarters, those questions made people shift in their seats. Croft had no prior use of force complaints, but his field training evaluations showed repeated notes about command presence and assertiveness, language that now looked uncomfortably vague. One evaluator had written that Croft needed to learn when to slow encounters down. That note, buried in a file, suddenly mattered. The superintendent ordered an immediate review of all probationary officers assigned to high-visibility posts. Several were quietly reassigned pending retraining. At the same time, the city's inspector general opened a parallel inquiry into whether courthouse security protocols created an environment where overpolicing was incentivized. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hill was contacted by the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division and asked if he would provide a sworn statement. He agreed without hesitation. During the interview, he described the subtle cues he recognized the moment Croft approached him: the narrowed eyes, the stance, the way suspicion arrived before conversation. He explained that he had chosen his words carefully because he knew how quickly things could spiral, especially in a public space. When asked how it felt to be handcuffed outside a courthouse by a fellow officer, Hill paused before answering. "It felt familiar," he said. That single word carried weight. Investigators noted it. Across Chicago, officers debated the incident openly for the first time in years. Some defended the idea of rookie nerves. Others rejected it outright, arguing that fear did not excuse ignoring clear identification. Retired commanders weighed in, pointing out that the fastest way to lose control of a scene is to assume disrespect where none exists. Community groups organized forums, inviting officers to listen rather than speak. Attendance was uneven, but the conversations were raw. Parents asked whether their children would be treated differently without a badge. Officers asked whether hesitation would now be punished. The answer, unspoken but clear, was that hesitation in the service of verification was not weakness, it was professionalism. In the background, the legal machinery continued grinding forward. Hill's attorneys drafted a notice of intent to file a federal civil rights lawsuit, nomming the city, the department, and Croft individually. City lawyers advised settlement discussions might begin early, not as an admission, but as a recognition of the video's clarity. Internally, CPD leadership prepared for another blow. The Civil Service Board scheduled an expedited hearing to ratify Croft's termination, a procedural step that would make reinstatement virtually impossible. The union signaled it would not aggressively contest the firing, an implicit acknowledgement of how indefensible the footage was. On the courthouse steps, a small plaque appeared temporarily, placed by activists overnight, reading, "Accountability happened here." It was removed within hours, but photos circulated anyway. By Sunday night, national commentators framed the story not as an outlier, but as evidence of a system that only corrected itself when the wrong person was detained. Hill watched some of the coverage from home, then turned it off. He knew the next phase would be slower, quieter, and more exhausting. Depositions, filings, reviews, policy changes debated line by line. The urgency of the moment would fade, but the record would remain. And inside the department, every new officer would now be taught using the same footage, the same warning, the same lesson written in unmistakable terms, that a badge without judgment is a liability, and that one decision made in seconds can end a career before the day is done. As the second week unfolded, new details surfaced that added pressure to an already strained department and made it clear that the firing was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a wider unraveling. Internal emails obtained by investigators showed that courthouse security supervisors had raised concerns months earlier about inexperienced officers being placed alone on exterior posts without direct oversight. One message, sent less than 6 weeks before the incident, warned that the courthouse environment required advanced judgment because of the constant presence of judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and plainclothes law enforcement from multiple agencies. That warning had been acknowledged, then quietly sidelined due to staffing shortages. Now it was back at the center of the conversation. COPA added the emails to its file, noting that while Croft made the decision to detain Hill, the system had placed him in a position where a single bad decision could explode publicly. That distinction mattered, not to excuse what happened, but to understand how it was allowed to happen at all. At the same time, previously undisclosed footage from a nearby news crew emerged, showing the crowd's reaction more clearly than the body cam alone. In that video, several people can be heard telling Croft to stop, one voice distinctly saying, "That's a cop," seconds before the cuffs went on. Croft does not respond. He does not pause. He tightens his grip. Investigators marked that moment as critical evidence that outside information contradicting his assumption was ignored. On talk radio and social platforms, the debate intensified. Supporters of Hill argued that the incident proved rank and service meant nothing once bias took hold. Critics attempted to frame the firing as political, but struggled to explain away the footage. Legal analysts pointed out that the chief's rapid termination decision was likely driven by one fact above all others. The detention occurred outside a courthouse, under multiple cameras, involving a sworn officer with verifiable credentials. Had it happened in a less visible space, the outcome might have taken weeks instead of hours. That reality unsettled many listeners. Inside CPD, the superintendent ordered an immediate policy bulletin clarifying that any detention of an individual claiming law enforcement status required supervisor confirmation before restraints could be applied, absent an immediate threat. The bulletin was read aloud at roll call. Officers signed acknowledgement forms. Quietly, several commanders admitted that the policy already existed, but had not been enforced with urgency. Lieutenant Hill was asked to participate in a closed-door training session with senior leadership, not as a spectacle but as a voice. He declined to be filmed. He spoke candidly about how authority feels when it is questioned, how easy it is to mistake calm for defiance, and how dangerous that misinterpretation can be. "You don't rise to the moment," he told them. "You fall to your habits." The room was silent. Meanwhile, Croft's termination paperwork moved through the Civil Service Board without delay. His appeal window narrowed by the day. Former Academy classmates avoided mentioning his name. In private, some admitted they were scared, not of accountability, but of how fast everything collapsed once the footage was undeniable. Federal investigators returned to Chicago for a second round of interviews, this time focusing on command decisions made after the cuffs came off. They wanted to know who made the call to fire Croft the same day, what legal advice was given, and whether the speed was meant to protect the department or acknowledge the harm. The chief answered directly. "Both," he said. Outside the courthouse, another small demonstration formed, quieter than before but more deliberate. Signs read, "Policy without practice is just paper." The phrase spread online. As night fell, Hill prepared for another workday, aware that his name was now tied to a moment that would be cited in briefs, trainings, and debates for years. He had not sought that role, but he understood it. The city moved forward, the department adjusted, and the investigation widened, with more findings expected, more testimony scheduled, and a growing sense that what happened on those courthouse steps was no longer just about one rookie cop, but about how close the system always is to repeating itself.